This episode of Mike Plays RP-1 will see the building and flying of my version of the Bell X-1 rocket plane, with the goal of having our first Kerbal break the sound barrier. This mission will require specific training for our pilot, as well as the use of the Airlaunch system RP-1 provides. In addition, I'll be taking a closer look at using fly-by-wire in the AtmosphereAutopilot mod, a flight mode that makes flying your aircraft much easier. Let's get started. We're starting off with a brief look at the fourth launch of the XASR-1 sounding rocket and its second fully automated launch using a script I wrote using Kerbal operating system, the full details of which was covered last episode. This is another launch purely for science, but considering almost all of this rocket gets recovered and it gets turned around in just over a month, the cost of these flights is very small and is well worth the 1.3 near-space science that was collected. This also represents the 9th rocket launch of this campaign, with still no launch failures. Fingers crossed, but with another successful splashdown, it's time to turn back the clock 3 months to the designing of the X-1 rocket plane, which started off with the newly unlocked X-1 cockpit. This cockpit can hold one Kerbal and is modeled after the real-world Bell X-1 cockpit, in which was strapped in Chuck Yeager when he broke the sound barrier in October of 1947. It comes equipped with a couple of experiments. The first is Supersonic flight, which requires you to travel between 450 and 500 meters per second. This experiment collects a 2 kilogram sample. I'm not quite sure what that could be, but it takes 24 minutes to collect it all. As one of the goals of this flight is to break the 600 meter per second speed record contract, I don't think I'll be flying in this speed range long enough to make this experiment worthwhile. That said, it may well be something to include in subsequent flights. The second available experiment is Mach 2 flight. Again, it's a sampling experiment, but now requiring a speed between 620 and 670 meters per second, which may be beyond the eventual capabilities of this aircraft. Like the P-40 cockpit I used for the MiG-15 from episode 4, this cockpit is equipped with an ejection seat, though you cannot eject above an altitude of 15 kilometers or at a speed of more than 330 meters per second. Though the cockpit is unpressurized, it is equipped with an air pump to provide oxygen to the pilot, allowing you to safely get them up to an altitude of 30 kilometers. Notice as well the relatively hefty 6,000 Kerbal entry cost for the part. The engine will be the XLR-11, the same engine used on the original. This engine is pressure fed, though not subject to ullage, and unlike previous engines has unlimited ignitions and can be throttled down to a minimum throttle of 25%. All good stuff considering there'll be a pilot aboard this thing. There is also a 5,000 funds entry cost to get the first version of this engine. This plane ain't gonna be cheap. As a rocket, this engine uses ethanol for fuel, but requires onboard oxidizer in the form of liquid oxygen as well as nitrogen for pressurization. I felt this was too much to be stored in the wing, so instead I created a fuel tank which will make up part of the fuselage. I then created a smooth cone fuselage part to create a housing for the engine, another smooth cone between the engine housing and the fuel tank, and a third one between the fuel tank and the cockpit. I also temporarily colored the fuel tank red so I can keep track of it. This engine is rated to burn for up to an hour. I don't plan to fly that long, but this allows me to incrementally increase the size of the fuel tank until this vessel can reach a speed of 600 meters per second, tweaking down the other fuselage parts to control the total length while keeping the fuel tank centered over the wings. Speaking of which, the lifting and control surfaces were all built out of the newly unlocked Supersonic procedural parts, but otherwise they were built and tweaked in the same way as for the M15. Each wing had two control surfaces, the outer to control roll while the inner was set to be spoilers, while at the back went a rudder to control yaw and elevators to control pitch. all along shooting to get the thing looking more or less like the real-world X1. To that end, I added one more procedural wing to help create a smoother transition to the tail. I'm starting to get used to the Ferram Aerospace analysis window, well, a bit anyway. To access it, click the Ferram button in the menu bar. All I'm starting to wrap my head around here is the data and stability derivatives. You start by putting in an altitude and speed. The contracts I'm targeting require getting above an altitude of 20 kilometers and a speed of 600 meters per second. So I made the altitude 22 kilometers and the Mach number 2. For now, all I'm looking for is no red in the numbers, so I'm calling this a win for a first go. We will also have to land, so let's try a 1 kilometer altitude and a 0.35 Mach number. Okay, let's try slower. Wow, this is actually only about 34 meters per second. We aren't going to be going that slow, but still, I think this is just about ready for a first simulation. First though, it needs some landing gear. The small landing gears still seem a little large, so I tweaked them down to 75% of their original size. Also, as this plane won't be taking off from the runway, the rear gear can be anywhere behind the center of mass of the vehicle, and it even helps with landing if the forward gear is tucked in a little more than the rear ones, so the nose will be pitched down when it's sitting on the runway. Okay, let's give her a simulation and find out how air launching works. In simulation mode, the air launch window is accessed by selecting Kerbal Construction Time on the menu bar. The default numbers are all the maximums that are currently allowed. Unlocking further tech will increase your air launch capabilities. What's not shown here is the maximum mass and dimensions of the launch craft. This can be viewed by looking at the tech node itself in the R&D center. Make sure your plane is within these restrictions. As you can see, I can launch from up to 1,000 kilometers away from the Space Center. You definitely want to pick a number from which you can make a runway landing. Azimuth is your compass bearing from the Space Center. With the numbers here, we would be launching from 1,000 kilometers east of the KSC. Launch azimuth is the craft's heading at launch. You can also adjust your launch altitude and velocity. These max numbers are based upon the aircraft that would have been available at the time. The original X1 was dropped from a B-29 bomber, so you're naturally going to have some altitude and speed restrictions. That this plane could fly 1,000 kilometers seems ambitious, so I changed it to 100 kilometers and hit launch. Not using any of the flight assists for now. This is so I can get a better feel for the craft. I tried pitching up quite steeply to get to the 20 kilometer altitude, but was soon losing precious speed. This engine just isn't that powerful. That all said, for a first iteration, this flew pretty well, and the 100 kilometer starting distance seemed like a good choice as I comfortably made it to the KSC, though, not surprisingly, the landing was a little less than ideal. With subsequent simulations, I used the cruise flight controller that comes with the AtmosphereAutopilot mod, and realized pretty quickly the higher your altitude, the better the engine performed. Well, of course, it's a rocket. All rocket engines perform better as the atmospheric pressure drops. The key was finding a climb rate that still allowed you to build speed as you ascend. Then came the process of increasing the size of the fuel tank until I got the plane to accomplish what I needed, each time decreasing the size of the other fuselage parts to keep the total length about the same, and, of course, continually checking the stability derivatives. If you hover over any of these numbers, you will get more information about it. With this red one, I got change in Z direction acceleration, that's the up direction, with respect to X direction velocity, which is forward, should be negative. So, at this altitude and speed, as my forward velocity increases, my upward acceleration also increases, but it should decrease. If you have a number you don't like, make small changes to the dimensions of the craft, each time noting whether things are getting better or worse until you get what you want. In this case, reducing the length of the fuselage section ahead of the fuel tank is what did the trick. In fact, I eventually got rid of this part entirely. With more fuel, my plane was traveling further, so I increased the launch distance from the Space Center from 100 kilometers to 150 kilometers. After a couple of more iterations, I was comfortable enough to call it and begin dressing it up, starting with using a procedural structure part to fashion an antenna to be placed at the wingtips, followed by the obligatory painting and decals. Then came the addition of a drag chute to help with landing. For this, I used the radial parachute from the Real Chute mod, tweaking it to its smallest size, selecting drag in the options, and leaving everything else on the defaults. The first landing was successful despite me forgetting to arm the parachute, which had me touching down at too high a speed. Such a high speed, in fact, that the tires burnt off. Oh, I like all the smoke. I was still quite pleased, but figured a restart was in order with the hope of landing at least once properly while still in simulation mode. That worked a lot better. As you may recall, when Evelyn Wolf broke the 15-kilometer altitude record in the MiG-15, I unlocked half a dozen new leaders that I'm pretty sure I could hire as flight directors. However, to have that position available, I need to get a crew to an altitude of 25 kilometers. As this plane was already comfortably reaching 20 kilometers, I figured that shouldn't be a problem, but in fact, once a little over 20 kilometers, the plane had difficulty generating enough lift to keep climbing. Perhaps a different ascent trajectory may help here, but I decided to stick with the original plan and leave this higher altitude record for some future flight. As I'm sure you've noticed, I use the cruise flight controller of the AtmosphereAutopilot mod a lot with my planes, but I've not been using the standard fly-by-wire feature, and as we'll see momentarily, that turns out to be a bit unfortunate as it is incredibly useful. In addition, with the benefits of some comments on previous videos, I've also figured out how flaps work. So I'm going to briefly share that information with you now ahead of the flying of this plane by joining Evelyn in simulation mode with the MiG-15. If we scroll in here a little bit and take a close look at our flaps, instead of having them toggle to the brakes and brakes making them go full on, I have them toggled to 1 and 2 on the action groups. And if I press 1, notice they only deploy a little bit. And if I press 1 again, they deploy a little bit more. And if I press 1 one more time, they deploy fully. So in total, I actually now have 4 different settings for these flaps. And if I press 2, that brings the deployment down. That gives me a lot more control on the drag being applied to this craft. Now, the other thing I want to do is if I bring up the Atmospheric Autopilot mod, which I've been using a fair bit with all of my planes, what's a really dumb thing that I've been doing is, instead of going into craft settings and stuff that I did before, if I simply clicked on the master switch and left it on standard fly-by-wire, notice that it's on by default. I've been turning it off, but it's on by default for a reason. Watch what happens if I throttle up and punch this thing. We obviously have to get up to speed before we can take off, but I want to do this in a continual shot to show you there aren't any tricks that I'm performing here, because discovering this has actually been a bit of a godsend for me. But yeah, we're getting pretty close to the ability to take off. Lift up the gear, but notice I have got my hands away from the keyboard. I'm not doing anything, and it is maintaining its current attitude, including the pitch. I'm going to throttle down a little bit so that we don't end up going all too fast. If I turn off the master switch, notice what happens. It will take a nosedive right away, because it is taking it off of the fly-by-wire. As well, if I put on SAS, which is a very intuitive thing to do, I also turn off the fly-by-wire, and now this is the way I've been flying my planes normally, and this is stock habits. But in stock, where you have these powerful reaction wheels in the cockpit, something that is absent in RP-1, sorry, I gotta put the SAS off, so I'm back on the master, back on fly-by-wire. without those powerful reaction wheels, holding attitude becomes a bit of a pain, and that's why they have this fly-by-wire here for you. Again, my hands are away from the keyboard, and it's just holding this perfectly. Now, I could still use the cruise flight controller that you see me using a lot. That works still perfectly fine. That part is great. But this fly-by-wire is awesome, and if I open up the GUI, there is a lot of information in here, but the one you want on, again, it's on by default, is the moderation. Also, there are some shortcut keys which I finally learned. One is that P toggles the master switch on and off. See that? And now I'll put it back on again. So if I just press P, master switch toggles. And also, Shift P, and I would advise using the right shift button so that you don't affect the throttle. Shift P toggles that window on and off. And in fact, you don't even have to have that window open, because if you remember that P toggles that master switch, notice there's going to be a watch up here in the right corner. If I push P, notice fly-by-wire is disabled, P, fly-by-wire is on. So fly-by-wire is absolutely awesome. Let's get ourselves back to the KSC and show you how much easier. Let's get ourselves back to the runway and just show you how much easier this landing is going to be. So I'm just coming in here, flaps are fully deployed, and I want you to notice how slow I'm going. I'm only at around 64, 65 meters per second, yet I'm having no trouble maintaining a level flight. In fact, it kind of feels like I'm just driving a car. This is actually so much easier to just control your speed and to control your attitude. Okay, here we are. We are just coming down and bop. And that's it. You know, brakes come on and we are going to be coming to a stop. But there are still a couple of things I have to take care of before the inaugural launch of the X-1 rocket plane. The first being that this mission does require some astronaut training. Pilots require training in order to fly the X-1 cockpit. This training takes 10 days to complete and will last for 4 months before they will have to undergo the training again. Construction of the X-1 is scheduled to be completed on December 14th. It will take a week to mount the craft onto the carrier for an air launch, so I used Kerbal Alarm Clock to set an alarm to remind me to begin training on December 7th. That means the pilot will be ready on December 17th, a few days ahead of mission day on December 21st. The training doesn't seem to cost anything, so I trained both pilots so that I can get in a second flight later. With the X-1 now done, I click Prep for Air Launch to mount it onto the carrier. But even though this takes just a week, I still have other stuff happening in the meantime. One, of course, is the completion of the mission training, but after that came the unlocking of the post-war materials science tech node. I mentioned last episode that this increases the max efficiency of the launch complexes by 5%, allowing me to push out rockets more quickly. But it also gets me a service module for constructing payloads, radial decouplers, and aluminum fuel tanks. I then moved up early tracking systems for my next tech node. It's almost half researched anyway. This one gets me improved avionics and biological samples for additional science missions. And finally, another XASR-1 was completed. It was during the rollout of this rocket that the X-1 became ready for air launch. And as I prep for the launch, I want to quickly remind people that I figured out how fly-by-wire works only after this mission was completed, because the way air launching works is about to catch me a bit off guard. Okay, there he is. Oh, launching in. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Autopilot. Craft settings. Do. Okay. T. Z. Go. Level off. Fuck me. This isn't fair. Okay, stop. This isn't fair. Revert flight. Revert to launch. Let's try that. I did not expect that. That was not fair. Okay. T, Z. That's what you're dealing with first. Then you can worry about this. Craft settings. Okay. Z. Go. Master switch. Okay. Okay. I gotta look to see, is there a way? Oh my gosh. Okay, now I can turn this off. Okay, keep an eye on Kenneth. Oh my golly gumps. Okay, this is doing well now, right? Yes. That is so unfair. Okay, I wonder if there's a way to change that countdown. I'll have to look at the recorded evidence, as it were. Okay, let's look at contracts. We have the crude altitude at 20 kilometers and a crude speed record of 600. Hopefully we can still make those. They're pretty straightforward. There's no reason to really look at them any more deeply than that. Okay. Oh. Alright, leveling off. We are well over the speed of sound now. Just about to crack 20 kilometers. And hopefully we'll get this speed up to 600 and then I won't be such a grumpy Gus. Okay, we do have... Okay, we can select this. Excellent. Yeah, it's telling us we're running out of liquid fuel. Or liquid oxygen. Okay, we got the 20 kilometers, and as long as we can squeeze out the 600, we're fine. Don't run out of fuel, you stinker. Oh my god, just barely though. Just barely. Okay, let's get down to altitude. So I want to put this down to 500. Okay, our 2 contracts are complete. That's a total of 17 reputation for us, so that's pretty sweet. Now it's about getting him home. So I'm gonna put this heading at 271, and we really got to watch this pitch here. See, like, because if I put on the brakes, yeah, it wants to die. The pitch. Oh, yeah, the pitch is struggling with holding it, so we just need to lose some more speed here a bit. What is our glide angle? Our angle to the launch pad is about 11 degrees, so let's put this to 15. Whoops. 15. Should be good. And then maybe we can put this on, because I do want to lose speed. No, it's still struggling with that. 10. Okay, wait. Brakes off first. Brakes off first. Level off. Yeah, just keep it like that. Keep it like that. This still has a... Yeah, deflection of minus 15 degrees. It really does struggle with compensating for having those deployed too early. Launch pad, angle to launch pad is there. Let's put this to 10. It's now under 9 here. Let's try the brakes again. Again, we're watching that pitch indicator. As long as it can kind of hold it, kind of seems to be okay now. Yeah, and then that'll help us bleed off some speed here a little bit. Okay, this is going to level off around 500. Let's put this at 400. Okay. And once it levels off, I'm going to be taking control. Okay, so let's take the brakes off temporarily. Master switch, SAS on. Okay, up we go. Brakes, we need lower speed here. Come on. I'll come a little this way too. This is the hardest part, is just getting the speed right. It just takes so long to slow down. The stock air is so thick compared to this. It's just trying to do anything to slow down here a bit. Up. Come on, Kenneth. There we go. Let's look a little better. aiming for about a 100 meter per second, getting to the runway. A little bit offline though. Back online. Again, I did quick save, and I am not shy to use it. There's our parachute, and we lost our parachute. Okay, well, I think I'm gonna keep it. I'll live with that. We'll repair the plane. I mean, our pilot survived. There's no intact recovery. Came in a little bit, dropped a little bit too hard, did the bounce, and then just knocked the back. What did we lost? Yeah, lost the parachute. Like, just the parachute just skimmed on the runway there, and then I was really sort of losing control, and I did lose a wing. But nothing that can't be fixed, my friends. Nothing that can't be fixed. If I recover it in the state that it is, I think I gotta build an entire new one. Well, we'll see. I'm gonna do recover vessel. I don't want to build. I'm gonna recover normally, and then we'll rebuild. It's okay. Yeah. Because it's that, or I'm gonna have this in the spaceplane hangar, and I think that's, well, oh well. Decisions was made. All I had to do was double up that wing on the one side, didn't I? Better to, I think I made a mistake. Yeah, recovering to the hangar and then using symmetry to get the missing wing back would have been easy enough, but oh well. Regardless, we'll be definitely seeing this plane again. In addition, at Launch Complex 2, the V2 number 2 is just a month away from being rolled out. That launch will be featuring some more KOS scripting, but that's going to have to be for the next episode. In the meantime, I thank you for watching and hope to see you then.